Everybody, we're here starting one more Ask Dr. Adriana, and we are here with the beautiful Dr. Adriana. Hello, Adriana.
Hi, Vinny. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you today.
We're talking about codependency today, aren't we?
Yes.
So, what is codependency, Dr. Adriana? How can we start this?
Yeah, it's a big topic. I'm going to go ahead and give you the definition, the dictionary definition of codependency. It's excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner, typically one who requires support on account of an illness or addiction. That term is used a lot in mental health, particularly in addiction treatment. And it came from referring to the loved ones of someone who struggles perhaps with addiction, or could be some other kind of illness. And, they're dependent, they're codependent on each other. And there's some really interesting dynamics that can happen when people are codependent. So, for example, with drugs and alcohol, we'll often also hear the term enabling or enabler. So the codependent person, which could be a friend, a loved one, a partner, a family member, whatever, it's basically enabling the person to keep engaging in what's usually, self-destructive behaviors. They're giving them the money to buy the drugs, or they're providing them with drugs or alcohol. Not because they have malintent toward their person, but because they care about them and they have been convinced that, this person needs this thing, this substance, this money, whatever. Like, I have a client I'm working with right now, whose husband, she's addicted to pain pills. And she originally, like many people, got put on those pain pills for injury, for pain, back pain. And then she became dependent on them and built up a tolerance to them and had to keep taking more and more. And her husband and perhaps other people in the family, kept finding ways to get pills for her, including illegal ways to get pills, beyond doctors' prescriptions, because they thought she was in pain and suffering and needed it. But in actuality, what they were doing was enabling her to continue to misuse and abuse her pills, rather than actually working with the medical team to figure out what's really going on with her pain, and maybe find some other strategies for managing it. So, now she's dealing with an addiction issue, and we have to give a lot of education. A lot of times the loved ones of people who have addiction don't really understand addiction and don't understand what their loved ones are going through. And so, like, for example, at the rehab where I work, we have a family program where we try to educate people on this topics. And specifically, we're going to cover codependency as part of that. So, of course, there's a healthy amount of, I want to say that this is along a spectrum, right? Of course, we are all, interconnected, and in our systems, family, work, friendships, we all depend on each other for different things, emotional support, sometimes financial support, things like that. I'm not saying that's bad or wrong, but when it becomes codependent, it's further down the spectrum, and there are elements of it that are toxic. Here's another definition of codependency. A codependency can be defined as any relationship in which two people become so invested in each other that they can't function independently anymore. Your mood, happiness, and identity are defined by the other person. In a codependent relationship, there's usually one person who's more passive and can't make decisions for themselves. And so they're kind of giving up their sovereignty and their identity, and a more dominant personality who gets some reward and satisfaction from controlling the other person and making decisions about how they will live. So that's a bit of the shadow side of codependency that people don't often acknowledge. Because if you talk to the person who is codependent and not fully aware of the fact, they'll just say, well, my person that can't care for themselves, or they can't fend for themselves, they need me. The person who's codependent, who's that more dominant codependent person, feels like needs to be needed. So this person being dependent on me, I get something out of it. I feel important. I feel needed. They won't leave me because they depend on me. right? So this is where it can get a little bit toxic. This is where it can get a little bit entangled. And often what I say when I bring in, let's say like the access consciousness or energy psychology perspective to it, what I really see with codependent people is that they're energetically enmeshed, right? Everything the other person thinks, feels, experiences, even in their body, you also will feel it. And if you're not aware and you're not asking questions, you may come to believe that what you're feeling and thinking and experiencing is your stuff, right? And access, there's this term, intertwining of beingness, that you'll hear sometimes Dane talk about it. I've heard Shannon talk about it as well, where it's like that enmeshment, and you end up feeling all of the things that the other person isn't even aware of, like all the stuff that's like below their conscious awareness, including all their pain and suffering. I can remember, for example, being on the phone with a boyfriend, and I said something kind of, sarcastic or snarky that he took personally. And I'm the one who immediately started crying. And I couldn't understand, like, why am I upset? Like, I'm the one, you know what I mean? Like my feelings weren't hurt, and I realized I was feeling everything he was feeling in response to it. So it can get very complicated, as you can imagine, like where you can't tell where you end and the other person begins. And that's when it's not really functional. And that's when you really have to ask, is this working for me?
So Adriana, what can we do? Like, what tools can we use to become more aware of that, like of those dynamics? Because I get when people are functioning from a codependency relationship, they're probably not aware that that's happening. If they're aware, there's something right there or something they love that doesn't allow them to be fully aware and like leave or choose something different.
Well, I mean, you always, the power of the question. We talk about this, with access consciousness. A question empowers, an answer disempowers. So ask questions. Am I codependent? This is also, another dynamic that can come into play here is the energy vampire dynamic. For example, like after being with this person, after spending time with them or being on the phone with them, do I feel calm and relaxed and at peace? Or do I feel riled up? Or do I feel really depleted? Have they kind of sucked my energy dry? That might be an indication as well of a more codependent kind of dynamic going on. Here's where I actually think, some of the traditional psychological literature and perspective on codependency is pretty accurate. I don't know, with my podcast and stuff, I'm not always in agreement with some of the more traditional perspectives on mental health. But in this case, I do think there's some useful information. There is, for example, Vinny, if you can share it in the chat link, in the chat box, in the whatever comment section, this link from CODA, which is a 12-step organization known as Codependence Anonymous. And it has kind of a checklist in a sense, am I codependent? And it gives you some descriptions that I think are really helpful around, in fact, maybe I'll even screen share. I don't often do that. But let me share this with you guys so that you can kind of get a sense for what this looks like. So this is a brochure, basically, that you get from online on the website, or, when they do in-person meetings, they'll have this as paper version. And so you have here all different kinds of characteristics. You've got some denial patterns. So codependents often have difficulty identifying what they're feeling. How do you know what's true for you if you're so enmeshed and in someone else's universe, right? They may minimize, alter, or deny how they truly feel. So this in access terms is when you say, you might be bending, folding, stapling, and mutilating yourself to fit someone else's reality, thinking I need to be what they want me to be. Oftentimes codependent people who are doing codependent patterns perceive themselves to be completely unselfish or dedicated to the well-being of others. There can be this martyr kind of energy, where I'm sacrificing myself for the good of my family or my partner or whatever. So that's one way it can show up. When you're looking at low self-esteem patterns, they may have difficulty making decisions. hard to receive recognition or compliments or praise, can't assert themselves and ask for what they need and want, very concerned with other people's approval, seeking validation, and almost valuing other people's opinions more than their own. Oftentimes there are core false beliefs at the root of it, things like they don't perceive themselves to be lovable. So I'm unlovable, I'm not enough. Therefore, I have to cling on to this person desperately. There's often a real fear of abandonment that you'll see with these codependent kind of patterns. This one is when someone, maybe compliance patterns, when someone shows up a bit more submissive, where you're compromising your values in some way, maybe doing things sexually that you actually don't feel comfortable doing, but you're afraid to say no to the partner because they may reject you and you'd rather hold on. So you can see codependent patterns in abusive relationships. It's actually quite common. And often with that kind of classic dynamic of the narcissistic type personality with a more codependent, submissive type partner. That's sort of a classic dynamic we see a lot in rehab. And then people, to try to escape the pain of all of that and to have something that's actually their own, like I can be myself when I'm drinking, or I can be myself in my little bubble of, intoxication. Oftentimes people will escape into that. So codependents themselves can often have addiction issues. Sometimes they remain in toxic situations for too long. Again, very sensitive to others' feelings and take them on, put aside their own interests, can accept sex as a substitute for love. So it really can show up in very different ways. Control patterns. They try to convince others what to think, do, or feel. They become resentful when others decline their help or reject their advice. They're the ones who might be offering advice that wasn't asked for. Oftentimes you'll see this kind of love bombing, lavishing gifts and favors on those they want to influence. They can use sex for that means as well. Have to feel needed in order to have a relationship with others. So, you can ask yourself, do I have some of these characteristics, especially in my relationships? And then this avoidant version, judge harshly what others think, say, or do. They might avoid intimacy to avoid feeling vulnerable. They may use indirect or evasive communication to avoid conflict or confrontation. They might believe displays of emotion are a sign of weakness. So this might be some of the martyr type energy. So I think this is I've always thought CODA had some really good literature on this. And, the classic book that most people read when they're first wanting to learn more about, and you can put this, Vinny, also in the comments box, is Codependent No More by Melody Beattie, Beatie. Pia Melody, Melody with 2 L's. She's also written on the topic. So those are sort of the classic texts. Codependent No More also has a workbook. It is more 12-step based, but I think that the principles themselves are pretty good. So that's some information if people are wanting to find out more. That's one place they can go just to kind of educate themselves. Gosh, there's so much more I could say about it. Let me pause there and see if you or anybody has any questions about what I've said so far.
I was wondering about like that dynamic where you put yourself like higher than the other people and looked at them as like you're saving them. Like both of the people are codependents. They're considered codependents, like instead of just one. Because like the first person that puts themselves like in a victim position, that doesn't seem like initially codependency for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it can be, right? Because if you're in a victim position, then you might fit some of the boxes on that handout. Like you can't make decisions for yourself. You believe yourself to be powerless. You believe yourself to be unlovable, and you need somebody else to take care of you, right? That might create that side of it. And then what I think you're referring to is something that we talk about in Access Consciousness, is playing the role of superior asshole, where because it is actually a superior position. If you're looking, and it is looking down, okay, and people don't want to admit to that, because if you're functioning from the, I'm the sort of the savior, I'm here to help these poor people who can't take care of themselves, then you're judging them. You're judging them as inferior, and you're judging the choices that they're making as inferior choices. The example I often give is the homeless. I've always lived in places where there were homeless people for the most part. Grew up in New York City. I live in San Francisco. There are homeless people on my corner all the time. And I used to feel sorry for them. Oh, these poor people, they're sick, they're mentally ill, they're addicted. Yeah, and they're choosing to live that way, especially here in San Francisco. There's so many resources for the homeless. There's not one person who needs to be living on the streets. They have support systems, they have housing, they have programs. You can go places and take a shower. You can even go get acupuncture. You can get a haircut. Homeless people have a tremendous amount of resources available to them, and yet they're continuing to choose to live that way. When I used to work with folks that were oftentimes homeless, I was surprised to hear that many of them were consciously choosing that. I don't want to live indoors. I like living outside. Or I don't want to live somewhere where there's rules and regulations and they're telling me how to live. I don't want to spend my money on rent when I could be spending it on what I want, which is drugs or alcohol. I mean, it was really surprising to me, and it changed my perspective, because here I am feeling sorry for these poor people, when in fact they're making the choice to live like that. And who am I to say that the way they're living is any better or worse than the way I am living? So that really shifted. Access helped me to shift my perspective on that. So if you're the person who's in that position, in a sense, you may be codependent because you need people to need you. You want people to be dependent on you so you can feel good about yourself. So I'd be asking some questions about, like, what's motivating me to do that? Have I already judged myself to be not enough, bad, wrong? And so I have to be, to serve others in this kind of way in order to feel good about myself. That's different from coming from a place of generosity of spirit. True generosity of spirit wouldn't come with all that judgment. There's a lot of judgment involved in codependency, for sure.
And I like what you just said, because they're completely different energies, the generosity of spirit and the superior asshole. Like it's really different worlds. Yeah. So I started wondering, like, how, like, practically, what can we do, like, to not only identify those behaviors that are, like, indicating that we are in a codependent relationship, but what can we do to, like, change this? Like, because oftentimes you see yourself in a position where it's not really easy to change the situation. For example, like when you're in a relationship, let's say you're married, 5 years married with the same guy, and you identify you're in a codependent relationship. Like, what could you use in your day-to-day to, like, start at least changing that dynamic?
Yeah, well, it's funny, the first question that pops is, am I the same person today that I was when I met this person? Now, and the reason I say that question, of course, we're all evolving and changing, but in what way have you changed? Have you given up perhaps some of the things that you used to love to do? Or you given up some of your friends, or given up a job that you used to love in favor of being with this person? Because maybe you think they need you all the time, or you think, gosh, that just happened recently. I was talking with a client about that, where they were like, basically, I gave up. Oh, yeah. That the partner had a medical crisis, and she gave up her work that she loved to stay home with him, probably beyond when he needed it, and then now is left with some resentment. The codependent person often develops, a resentment about the situation they've gotten themselves into. It could be a resentment toward the partner, it could be a resentment toward themselves, could be both. So I say, what have you let go of? Like, what dreams have you let go of? What activities or people have you let go of that maybe you could reconnect with? I mean, it would start with carving out something for yourself. We always tell in rehab, we talk about, the instructions they give you on the airplane. In the event of an emergency and the oxygen mask falls, put it on yourself first and then put it on someone else, right? That concept. So what can you do for yourself? Can you take half an hour a day to just do something you enjoy doing? And I often will recommend this for mothers, because especially when you have young kids and you have a home or partner, if you're a stay-at-home mom, or even if you're a working mom, when do you ever have time for you? You can be so busy caregiving for everyone else that you lose yourself. So carving out, 30 minutes, and maybe it is getting up half an hour earlier than everyone else, so you can have that 30 minutes to meditate or exercise or go for a walk or read the newspaper or go on Instagram. It doesn't matter what it is, but can you give yourself that time? Dane, Dr. Dane here, who's a great inspiration to me and, is the co-creator of Access Consciousness. He says, what if you could even do an hour a day for yourself and 1 day a week? I mean, I think that would be something wonderful if people could embrace that. I try to do that. And build from there. But if you can only do 10, 15 minutes, start there. Just do something for yourself and reconnect with yourself and what brings you joy. I think that's first and foremost. And then really being willing to ask questions and take a hard, honest look at your dynamics with people and see if they're actually working for you. And if not, then what needs to change? Have you stayed in a relationship too long that maybe needs to end? Are there ways to change the dynamics in the relationship? Maybe going to therapy with that person, is that an option? Just starting there, at least first and foremost with yourself, and then looking at the dynamics in the relationships and what could change. And if things can't change, how can you have more allowance? If you're choosing to stay in a relationship that isn't great for you, but you have your rationale or justification for staying in it, then what would it take to have more allowance for this, right? How can I be more at peace with this? What would I have to be or do different that would allow me to be in this relationship and still be me, or still be able to live my life in the way I choose? It's complex. It's not an easy topic.
Yeah, it's not an easy topic. And like from what you're saying, like it basically comes down to like discovering and being more for yourself, so you can have a bit of space to separate yourself from the other person. Like you were saying, like the entanglement, like you end up being like starting to disentangle a bit here, a bit there, like, and having more space for you so you can have more space in the relationship.
Yes.
And when you were saying, like, I get it's important, really important to know that as soon as you become aware that you're in a codependent relationship, not try to change the other person, because then we would go into the saving stuff. Like I need to change it. Like, so this really is a complex topic. Would you like to say something else about this?
Yeah, I mean, that whole thing of I need the other person to change in order for me to be okay. I mean, that's like one of the underlying belief systems, which I love TJ, my colleague and co-creator of many things, calls BS systems. Your belief systems are your BS systems. Codependency's got some real BS systems attached to it. Like I need this person to change, or I need this person to be okay so I can be okay. So that leads you toward the saving. It puts you also in superior asshole position, but it also leads you toward the saving. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about all of this with some pragmatic tools in a workshop that I'm doing, I believe next week. Yeah, a week from today. Who or what are you trying to save? So codependency is definitely going to be a big topic in that. The last Ask Dr. Adriana, we talked about hoarding, which to me is another version of who or what are you trying to save. So it's a pretty broad topic, but I love the idea of taking a deeper dive and really offering folks some facilitation. I'll probably be using primarily access consciousness tools. So we'll give you some tools and some clearings around some of these issues, the intertwining of beingness, the who does this belong to, different strategies that I have found for myself and for the many, many clients I've worked with. I mean, this is one of the most common things I see in relationship dynamics and people coming to therapy with troubled relationships. This is often a common denominator across that. So if you guys are interested in finding out more, this workshop might just be up up your alley and you're just what you need if you're really willing to look at this issue and maybe make some changes.
Yeah, the workshop is out and it's really great. The link is in the chat. You all can click there and check more about it.
Yeah. The good news is that anything is changeable, as we know. I always talk about energy. Everything is energy, including codependent dynamics. They're energetic. Like I said, it's an energetic enmeshment. And our thoughts, our beliefs, our feelings, even our physical sensations are all energy. They're all malleable and changeable. So if you find yourself struggling with this particular dynamic, and you're codependent in your relationships with people, you can change that. If you have the intention and the willingness and the motivation, and again, you're willing to take an honest look at yourself and what you're choosing, you can choose something different and you can change this.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Dr. Adriana, for coming here today and talking about a bit about codependency. And I guess we see each other in 2 weeks for the next Dr. Ray.
Yep. I'll be back again in 2 weeks on another episode of Ask Dr. Adriana. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana.
Thanks, everyone.